air was a sterile vacuum, scrubbed of life. It tasted of ozone and chilled metal, a manufactured purity that coated Elian's tongue and throat. He stood on the dais, a figure sculpted from ivory and expectation, the ceremonial white silks of his tunic falling in perfect geometric folds. Before him, the assembly hall of the apex spire spread like a dissected fan, its tiers filled with the still, watchful faces of the consolidated houses. They were not people. They were witnesses, judges, investors in the merger his bonding would represent. The light that filled the chamber was not sunlight. It was a cold, blue-white luminescence that bled from the crystalline walls, rendering everything flat and depthless, a portrait painted without shadow. It stripped the warmth from his skin, leaving behind a porcelain chill that seemed to sink into his bones. He could feel the low, subsonic hum of the spire's atmospheric regulators through the soles of his soft slippers, a constant, oppressive reminder of the machine in which he was a single, perfect cog. He was Elian of House Valerius, the most coveted Omega of his generation, and in precisely 7 minutes he would be bonded to Marcus of House Tiberian. The union would solidify the Valerius-Tiberian industrial axis for the next century. He was not a son. He was not a person. He was an asset, a treaty signed in flesh. His father, Archon Valerius, stood to his left, a monolith of grey severity, his scent a tightly controlled whisper of cedar and steel, chemically muted to the point of abstraction. To Elian's right stood Marcus, his intended alpha. Marcus was handsome in the way of classical statues, all sharp angles and curated perfection. His scent, too, was a phantom, a ghost of sandalwood and expensive spice that promised power but offered no heat. It was a scent designed for boardrooms, not for the soul-deep intimacy of a bond. Elian's gaze drifted past them to the far wall of the chamber, a seamless pane of smart crystal that looked out upon the city of Ethelberg. From this height, the city was a sublime circuit board, its transit lines glowing arteries of light, its lesser spires reaching up like supplicants. It was beautiful. It was a prison of sublime engineering. His own scent was a ghost, too, suppressed since childhood by a regimen of hormonal inhibitors and olfactory dampeners. He was supposed to smell of nothing, to be a blank slate upon which his alpha could later write his claim. He remembered the faint, sweet scent of rain on hot stone from his youth, a memory of a time before the gardens were enclosed, before his tutors had explained that an Omega's scent was a liability, a weakness to be disciplined. They had corrected him. They had perfected him. They had hollowed him out and filled the void with obedience. A chime, delicate as falling glass, echoed through the hall. 4 minutes. Marcus turned his head slightly, the movement economical and precise. A smile touched his lips, but it did not reach his eyes. His eyes were the color of polished chrome. "Are you prepared, Elian?" he asked. His voice was smooth, modulated, the perfect instrument of command. It held no warmth, no question. It was a statement of fact. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Prepared. The word was a scalpel. He was prepared in the way a specimen was prepared for display. His blood chemistry was balanced, his caloric intake monitored, his sleep cycles regulated. He was a flawless biological machine, primed for his function. But beneath the silk and the suppressants, a tremor had begun. It started in his hands, a fine, almost imperceptible vibration. He clenched them into fists within the long sleeves of his tunic, digging his nails into his palms. The small, sharp crescents of pain were a grounding sensation, a secret rebellion. He was here. He was real. This body, this trembling, terrified body, was his. He lifted his gaze to his own reflection, faintly superimposed over the city in the crystalline wall. The figure that stared back was a stranger, a pale, elegant creature with wide, haunted eyes, the color of a winter sky. The face was his, but the emptiness behind it was the system's creation. He saw the delicate gold torque around his neck, the symbol of his unbonded status, soon to be replaced by the heavier, permanent collar of House Tiberian. A cage for a cage. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the numb fog of his composure. It was a physical thing, a shard of ice sliding into his lungs. His breath hitched. The regulated air suddenly felt too thin, too clean. He couldn't breathe. He was drowning in it. He was not an asset. The thought was a heresy, a spark in the void. He was not an experiment. He was not a treaty. The repetition was a litany, a prayer to a God he didn't know if he believed in, a God of broken things, of wild things. The tremor spread from his hands to his arms, to his legs. He could feel the blood roaring in his ears, a chaotic ocean against the spire's sterile hum. Another chime. 1 minute. The officiant, a serene woman in grey robes, stepped forward, her hands holding the bonding collar. It gleamed under the cold light, a beautiful, perfect manacle. No, the word was not spoken. It was a cellular detonation. It was the shattering of a lifetime of conditioning. He saw the path ahead of him, a life of silent grace, of perfumed sterility, of bearing children who would also become assets, their scents scrubbed clean, their hearts disciplined into silence, a gilded, hollow eternity. And he chose chaos. He chose the unknown. He chose to run. He took one step back, then another. The movements were clumsy, alien to his trained body. Archon Valerius's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. The grip was like iron. Elian. His father's voice was a blade of ice, not a plea, a command, an override code. But the machine was broken. Elian twisted, ripping his arm free from his father's grasp. The sound of tearing silk was a gunshot in the silent hall. Gasps rippled through the assembly. He did not look at Marcus's shocked, perfect face. He did not look at his father's dawning fury. He looked at the reflection in the wall, at the terrified, defiant boy with his own eyes. And he ran. He ran from the dais, his soft slippers sliding on the polished floor. He ran past the stunned faces of the elite, their disbelief a tangible wave. He ran towards a service corridor he had only ever seen on architectural schematics, a place for maintenance drones and sanitation crews, a place for the unseen things that kept the perfect world running. The emergency release panel hissed open at his palm print, a final, ironic gift of his lineage. He plunged into the darkness behind it, into the guts of the machine, and the sterile silence of the assembly hall was replaced by the roar of ventilation fans and the scent of hot wiring and recycled air. He was falling, not through space, but through status, through safety, through everything he had ever known. And for the first time in his life, he felt the searing, terrifying thrill of being alive. Kael stood on the precipice of Sector Gamma 7, the wind a raw, scouring force against his face. It carried the sense of the lower city, ozone from the arc welders in the reclamation yards, the damp, loamy smell of hydroponic fungus farms, the sharp tang of unscrubbed human sweat. It was the smell of life, unfiltered and chaotic. Below him, the district was a tangle of repurposed megastructures and makeshift conduits, lit by the flickering glow of neon and the hard sodium yellow of industrial lamps. It was a world away from the serene, sterile luminescence of the apex spire that pierced the perpetual twilight of the upper atmosphere like a needle of ice. The spire was a symbol of everything he fought against, a system that prized bloodlines over strength, control over freedom, and sterile perfection over the beautiful, messy truth of existence. He was Alpha of the Corvus Syndicate, a house forged not from ancient lineage, but from the grit and desperation of the city's forgotten sectors. They called him a warlord, a barbarian, an upstart. He considered himself a pragmatist. His second, a lean, wiry beta named Reese, approached from the shadows of the transit platform. "Scouts report a disturbance at the Valerius Tiberian bonding," Reese said, his voice low and raspy. "The ceremony was aborted. The Omega is missing." Kyle didn't turn. His gaze remained fixed on the spire, a distant, glittering tooth in the mouth of the sky. "Missing," Kyle repeated. The word was sterile, clinical. It didn't capture the chaos such an event would unleash. An Omega of Elian Valerius's standing did not simply go missing. He was a strategic asset of immense value. His disappearance was not a family matter. It was a declaration of war. "Valerius will blame us," Reese continued, "or the Jade Syndicate. He'll use it as a pretext to tighten security, to push his enforcers deeper into the lower sectors." "Let him," Kale said, the wind pulling the word from his lips. "A cornered predator is a sloppy one." He had studied Archon Valerius for years. The man was a master of control. His empire built on a foundation of ruthless logic. But his greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He could not comprehend chaos. He believed everything could be managed, quantified, and contained. An Omega son who chose to run, who chose the unknown over a gilded cage. That was a variable Valerius's equations could not solve. It was an act of illogical, emotional defiance, an act of rebellion. Kale felt a flicker of something akin to respect for the unseen boy. A comm signal chimed in his ear, a coded burst from one of his perimeter patrols. "Alpha Kale," a tense voice reported. "We have a situation. Sector Gamma 9, Reclamation Alley 4. We found someone, an Omega. Matches the description of the Valerius boy." Kale's stillness broke. He turned to Reese, his dark eyes narrowed. "Status?" "Distressed, disoriented. He's alone." Alone. That was the detail that didn't fit. If this was a move by a rival faction, the Omega would be secured, hidden. Alone meant he was a runner, a true fugitive. "Secure the perimeter," Kale ordered, his voice dropping into the calm, quiet register he used for moments of high tension. "No one in or out. I'm going myself." Reese nodded, already relaying the commands. "What are your orders, Alpha?" "If it's him, he's leverage. The kind we've never had." Leverage. The word tasted like ash. Reese was right, of course. The boy was a key that could unlock the spire's gates or bring the entire house of Valerius to its knees. He was a weapon waiting to be aimed. Kale descended into the labyrinthine alleys of Gamma 9, his movements silent and fluid. The air grew thicker here, heavier with the metallic scent of decay and industry. He found his patrol crouched at the mouth of a narrow alley, their weapons lowered but ready. They parted for him without a word. The alley was a dead end, hemmed in by the rust-streaked hull of a decommissioned atmospheric processor. And there, huddled against the cold metal, was the source of the disturbance. He was a splash of impossible white against the grime and shadows. The ceremonial silks were torn and smeared with filth. but they still held the ghost of their former opulence. The boy was curled into himself, his arms wrapped around his knees, shivering despite the humid air. His hair, the color of spun moonlight, was matted and damp. He looked like a fallen star, something impossibly rare and beautiful that had crashed into the wrong world. Kale approached slowly, his heavy boots making no sound on the grimy pavement. He stopped a few feet away, observing. The boy didn't look up. He seemed to be in a state of shock, his senses overwhelmed by the raw, unfiltered reality of the lower sector. Then, Kale scented it. Beneath the layers of chemical suppressants that clung to the boy like a shroud, something else was stirring. It was faint, delicate, and utterly unique. A fragile, complex note of white tea and something clean, like the air after a storm. It was a scent that had been systematically smothered, and now, in the absence of its chemical prison, it was struggling to breathe. It was the scent of a powerful, high-born Omega, but it was raw, untamed, and laced with the sharp, acidic tang of terror. It was not leverage. It was not a weapon. It was the scent of a creature in profound distress. Kale had seen the same look in the eyes of wild data hounds caught in electro-traps, the sheer soul-numbing terror of a cage snapping shut. Only this boy had just escaped his. He was a problem, a political incendiary device dropped into the heart of Kale's territory. But he was also just a boy, terrified and alone, stripped of his name, his status, his entire world. Kale looked at the slender, trembling form, the pale skin, the delicate line of his throat where a golden torque still sat, a remnant of a life that had evaporated only hours ago. He saw the conditioning, the manufactured fragility, and he saw the spark of defiance that had driven him to run. He was a Valerius, an enemy, but in this moment, huddled in the filth and shadows, he was simply a refugee. Reese's voice came over the comm, quiet and expectant. Alpha? Kyle made a decision. It was not tactical. It was not strategic. It was something more fundamental. He raised his hand and gave a silent signal to his men. Stand down. Secure the area. No communication beyond this channel. He took a step closer. The boy finally flinched, his head snapping up, his eyes, wide and luminous, fixed on Kyle. They were filled with a terror so pure it was almost sublime. Kyle knelt, lowering himself to the Omega's level. He did not speak. He did not offer a hand. He simply held the boy's gaze, his own expression unreadable, calm. He was an alpha, a rival, a monster from the stories they told children in the spire. But he was not a cage. I am taking him, Kale said, into his comm, his voice a low, final command. He would deal with the consequences later. For now, he would contain the chaos. He would shelter the fallen star. Ilian woke to the unfamiliar sensation of texture. The surface beneath his cheek was rough, a coarse woven fabric that smelled faintly of dust and dried herbs. He blinked, his eyes gritty and slow to focus. The light was wrong. It was not the cold, clinical blue-white of the spire, but a soft, grey illumination filtering through a grime-streaked window. It was natural light, weak and diluted by the perpetual smog of the lower city, but it held a warmth, a reality that his system barely recognized. Panic, a familiar cold serpent, began to uncoil in his stomach. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. He was in a small, square room, the walls bare plasteel, the color of old bone. A single mattress on a low metal frame, a metal table, a chair. It was a cell. He had traded one cage for another. His memory returned in fractured shards. The pristine hall, the tearing silk, the dark, roaring tunnels of the service corridors, the overwhelming stench of the lower world, a sensory assault that had sent him reeling. And then, a face, dark eyes in a shadowed alley, a presence that was vast and calm and terrifyingly solid. The Alpha. He scrambled backwards on the mattress until his back hit the cold wall. The ceremonial silks he wore were ruined, stained and torn. The golden torque was still around his neck, a cold, heavy reminder of who he was, or who he had been. He was a commodity, a prize, and he had been captured. The door to the room slid open with a low hiss, and the Alpha stepped inside. He was taller than Elian remembered, his frame broad and powerful beneath a simple black tunic and cargo pants. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace that spoke of contained strength. His face was stark, carved with hard lines and shadowed by a day's growth of dark stubble. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, a faint white line against his tanned skin. He was the antithesis of Marcus Tiberian's polished perfection. He was raw, real, and dangerous. He carried a tray. On it was a bowl of something that looked like stew, a cup of water, and a small, sealed med pack. He placed the tray on the metal table without a word, his movements deliberate. Elian stared at him, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He tried to speak, to demand, to question, but his throat was locked tight with fear. He was a Valerius. He had been trained in negotiation, in wielding his status as both shield and sword. But here, in this bare room, stripped of his context, he was nothing. He had no power. He was just an Omega, alone with a strange Alpha, whose intentions were a terrifying mystery. The Alpha's scent filled the small space. It was nothing like the neutered, synthetic fragrances of the spire. It was complex and overwhelming. It smelled of ozone after a lightning strike, of wet earth, of pine resin and cold stone. It was a wild, untamed scent that spoke of dominance and territory. It terrified him, and yet it didn't feel threatening. It felt solid, grounding, a mountain in the chaotic landscape of his new reality. The Alpha finally looked at him. His eyes were a dark, indeterminate color, like deep water. They weren't cruel. They were observant, calculating. He was being assessed, measured. "You are safe here," the Alpha said. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than Marcus's modulated tones. It vibrated in the small room, in Elian's very bones. Safe. The word was a lie. How could he be safe? He was a prisoner, a political pawn. "Who are you?" Elian managed to whisper, the words scraping his raw throat. The Alpha's gaze didn't waver. "My name is Kale." Kale. The name echoed in the recesses of his memory. Kale of the Corvus Syndicate, the warlord of the lower sectors, the barbarian his father's intelligence briefings had painted as a ruthless opportunist, a cancerous growth on the ordered society of Ethelberg. He was the monster they used to frighten disobedient children, and he was standing in a room with him, offering him food. "What do you want?" Elian asked, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. He expected a demand, a ransom, a threat. Kale was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. "For now," he said slowly, "I want you to eat." He gestured to the tray. "Your system has undergone a shock. You need sustenance." The clinical nature of the statement was both unnerving and oddly reassuring. He wasn't talking about politics or leverage. He was talking about biology. He turned and left, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving Elian alone with the scent of ozone and the bowl of stew. Elian stared at the door, his mind racing. This was a strategy, a way to disarm him, to make him compliant. He shouldn't trust it. He shouldn't eat the food. It could be drugged. But the smell of the stew, hearty and real, rose to meet him, and his stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was painful. He hadn't eaten real, unprocessed food in years. His diet was nutrient-paced and calibrated supplements. Slowly, hesitantly, he slid off the mattress and approached the table. He picked up the cup of water and sipped. It was just water, clean, but with a faint mineral taste he'd never experienced. He looked at the stew. It was a simple mix of root vegetables and some kind of protein. He took the spoon and dipped it in. He brought it to his lips. The warmth spread through him, a shocking, grounding sensation. It tasted real. It tasted like food, not fuel. He ate, spoonful after spoonful, the simple act an anchor in the dizzying sea of his fear. As he ate, he became aware of another change. A warmth was spreading through his own body, a low, deep thrumming he hadn't felt since he was a child. It was the absence of the suppressants. His body, his true biology, was beginning to wake up from a long, chemically induced slumber. The scent he had been taught to despise, the part of him that was purely Omega, was stirring, and he was in a cage with a barbarian alpha. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through him, but this time it was different. It was not the abstract fear of displeasing his father. It was a primal, instinctual fear, and a primal, instinctual curiosity. He was stripped bare, not just of his silks and his status, but of the very chemistry that had defined him. He didn't know who he was anymore, and as he finished the stew, he realized, with a jolt of horror and wonder, that for the first time he was about to find out. Kale watched the feed from the hidden micro-camera on his private monitor. He saw the Omega, Elian, hesitate, then drink the water, then devour the stew with a desperate hunger that was painful to witness. The boy was a paradox. He was bred for the pinnacle of a society that valued aesthetic perfection and emotional castration, yet he had the feral desperation of a starving animal. Kale had seen him run on the security recordings he'd requisitioned from the Spire's public feeds, a blur of white silk against the cold chrome, an act of pure, suicidal instinct. It was the most courageous and foolish thing Kale had ever seen. He was an asset. Yes, Reese was right. The boy's existence in his custody could shatter the tentative peace between the houses and the lower sectors. He could be used to expose the hypocrisy of Archon Valerius, to force concessions, to ignite a war, or to prevent one. The strategic possibilities were endless, and his mind, trained in the cold calculus of survival and power, was already mapping them out. But watching the boy now, huddled in the Spartan room, the strategic calculations felt hollow. He saw the fine tremor in Elian's hands, the way he flinched at the sound of the door. He saw the deep, soul-level exhaustion in his pale face. This was not a chess piece. This was a person who had been systematically broken and was now utterly adrift. Kyle had seen it before, in new recruits scavenged from corporate indenture programs or reconditioning camps. The blank stare, the fear of open spaces, the disbelief at simple kindness. The Spire was just a prettier, more elegant version of the same machine. A machine that produced beautiful, functional, empty things. Kale himself was a product of that machine, or rather, a reject. He had been born into a low-tier house aligned with the Tiberians, an alpha destined for a mid-level security command. He had been trained, conditioned, evaluated. But the conditioning hadn't taken. The wildness in him, the refusal to bow to a system that judged a man by his blood, not his will, had been deemed a flaw. He had been cast out, exiled to the lower sectors, expected to die. Instead, he had thrived. He had found his own house, his own family, in the grit and chaos. He had built his own power, not on lineage, but on loyalty and strength. He saw a faint echo of that same flawed defiance in the Valerius Omega. He switched off the monitor. He would not watch the boy like a specimen in a lab. That was what his father did. He walked to the window of his command center, which overlooked the sprawling, chaotic heart of his territory. His people, scavengers, engineers, fighters, farmers, a messy, vibrant ecosystem that the Spire dismissed as a slum. They were free. That freedom was precarious, constantly threatened by the encroachment of the upper houses. But it was real. And now, he was harboring the embodiment of everything they stood for, the ultimate symbol of their gilded cage. Over the next few days, a strange, silent routine established itself. Twice a day, Kale would bring Elian food and water. He never stayed long. He never asked questions. He simply provided, observed, and left. He instructed Reese and the rest of his inner circle that the Omega was not to be disturbed. He was a guest, not a prisoner. The explanation was met with confused but obedient silence. They trusted his judgment, even when they didn't understand it. Kale found himself drawn to the silent observation. He watched as Elian slowly began to map the confines of his small room. He would trace the seams of the plasteel walls with his fingertips. He would stand by the window for hours, staring out at the sliver of smog-filled sky, his expression unreadable. He was like a creature adapting to a new, alien habitat. And the scent was changing. The cloying chemical smell of the suppressants was fading day by day, like a foul mist burning off in the sun. In its place, the Omega's true scent was beginning to bloom. The notes of white tea and petrichor were stronger now, deeper. But there were other complexities emerging. Something floral and elusive, like night-blooming jasmine. Something clean and sharp, like fresh mint. It was a scent of extraordinary complexity and subtlety, unlike the loud, simple fragrances of the few Omegas in the lower sectors. It was captivating. It was also dangerous. It was a beacon. Unshielded, a scent this potent would draw every unbound alpha within a mile. Worse, the specialized sensors of the House enforcers would eventually be able to track it. Time was running out. But more than the tactical problem, the scent was having an effect on Kale himself. It slipped past the iron control he maintained over his own alpha instincts. It wasn't a crude lure. It was more subtle, more insidious. It was a quiet question whispered directly to the most primal part of his brain. It felt like a resonance, a note that harmonized with the deep, steady thrum of his own scent. He found himself thinking of the Omega not as the Valerius boy or the asset, but as Elian. He found himself wondering what color his eyes would be if they weren't clouded by fear. He was becoming distracted. It was a weakness he could not afford. One evening, he brought the tray and found Elian standing by the window, his back to the door. He didn't turn when Kale entered. "They're broadcasting about me," Elian said, his voice quiet but clear. "I can see the news crawlers on the buildings. Omega Elian Valerius, tragically abducted by lawless elements. They are calling you terrorists." Kyle set the tray down. "Propaganda is the first weapon of the comfortable," he said. Elian finally turned. The fear in his eyes was still there, but it was overlaid with something else. A flicker of anger, of bitter irony. My father will be using this to justify a purge, to consolidate his power. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. He understood the machine he had escaped. Yes, Kyle confirmed. Elian's gaze dropped to the floor. He will not be searching for his son. He will be hunting for a stolen piece of property. The words were delivered with a chilling lack of emotion that was more devastating than any scream. He was not a son. He was not a person. Kale heard the echo of the boy's own internal litany. In that moment, the last of Kale's strategic calculations dissolved. The situation was no longer about leverage. It was about a person he had inadvertently taken under his protection, a person whose burgeoning scent was a siren call to both friend and foe, and whose awakening was becoming inextricably linked with his own. He had brought a fallen star into his world of shadows, and he was beginning to realize that its light, however faint, was changing everything. The days bled into one another, measured not by the chimes of the spire, but by the slow crawl of grey light across the window pane and the hiss of the door as Kale came and went. The routine was a fragile anchor in the sea of Elian's disorientation. Food, water, silence. The Alpha's presence was a constant, a silent monolith at the edge of his awareness. He was still terrified of him, of the raw, untamed power that emanated from him like heat from a furnace. But the fear was changing. It was less the fear of a captive for his jailer and more the cautious awe of a wild creature for a larger, more dangerous predator whose territory it had stumbled into. Kale had not harmed him. He had not threatened him. He had simply held him, contained him. The Spartan room was a cage, yes, but it was also a cocoon. Inside this cocoon, a strange and terrifying metamorphosis was taking place. The absence of the suppressants was like the slow peeling away of a shroud he had worn his entire life. Sensations were sharper, more vivid. The rough texture of the blanket, the mineral tang of the water, the hearty flavor of the stew, they were overwhelming, almost painful in their intensity. But the most profound change was happening inside him. A low, insistent warmth was building deep in his belly, a humming energy that grew stronger each day. It was his own body, speaking to him in a language he had been taught to ignore. It was the precursor to his heat. He had never had a true heat. They were medically suppressed, managed with cold efficiency, reduced to a set of inconvenient biological data points that were corrected before they could ever manifest. He had only read about them in medical texts, described with clinical horror as a period of primal regression, of lost control, a biological failing that the perfection of modern society had thankfully overcome. Now he could feel it coming. It was a tide, pulling at him from a deep, internal ocean. With it came the full, uncontrolled blooming of his scent. He could smell it on himself, a strange and complex perfume of rain and tea and sweet nocturnal flowers. It was the scent of his own soul, and it smelled of freedom and terror. He started to spend his days pacing the small room, a restless energy thrumming through his veins. He felt trapped, not by the room, but by his own skin. He was a stranger in his own body. The silence of the room became a canvas for memory. Without the constant hum of the spire's regulators, without the structured schedule of his former life, his mind drifted back. He remembered his childhood in the Valerius penthouse gardens, a marvel of bioengineering under a transparent dome. He remembered a day, he must have been 6 or 7, when a rare, genuine thunderstorm had rolled over the city. The power had flickered, and for a few minutes the atmospheric filters had failed. The scent of real rain on the heated soil of the garden had filled the air. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever smelled. He had presented as an Omega shortly after, and his own scent, when it first appeared, had carried that same note of petrichor. He had been proud of it. Then the tutors had come. A severe beta woman with a scent like dry paper had explained that his instincts, his scent, his very biology were flaws. They were weaknesses that enemies could exploit. They were messy, emotional, illogical. They were to be disciplined, erased. He remembered being placed in a small white room, much like this one, but sterile and cold. He remembered the first injection of the suppressants, a cold fire in his veins. He remembered the scent of rain fading away, replaced by a chemical nothingness. He remembered his father, Archon Valerius, observing him through a one-way mirror, his expression unreadable, but for a faint nod of approval. He had learned his lesson. He had become perfect. He had become empty. The memory was so vivid that he stumbled, his hand flying to his throat as if he could still feel the phantom prick of the needle. A wave of dizziness washed over him. His skin felt hot, flushed. The warmth in his belly coiled into a tight, painful knot. The preheat. It was starting. The door hissed open. Kyle stood there, holding the tray. But this time, he stopped just inside the doorway. His usual calm was fractured. His dark eyes were fixed on Elian, and his expression was tense, his jaw tight. The air in the room shifted, thickened. Kyle could smell it. He could smell the change in Elian, the sweet, feverish edge that now laced his scent. Elian's breath hitched. He felt a wave of shame so profound it almost brought him to his knees. This was it. The regression, the biological flaw. He was losing control, and this alpha, this barbarian, could see it. He could smell his weakness. He backed away, pressing himself into the corner of the room, trying to make himself small. "Stay away," he whispered, the words trembling. Kale did not move. He simply watched him, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. The scent in the room was intoxicating, a dizzying blend of fear and burgeoning need. It was a siren song, and it was taking every ounce of Kale's formidable control not to react to it, not to step forward and answer the instinctual call that was screaming through his own veins. He saw the shame and terror in Elian's eyes. He saw a boy who had been taught to hate himself. And in that moment, something shifted in him. The last vestiges of the strategist, the warlord, fell away, replaced by a fierce, unexpected wave of pure protectiveness. This was not a weakness to be exploited. It was a wound to be tended. He set the tray down just inside the door. He did not step further into the room, honoring the panicked plea. He met Elian's terrified gaze, his own expression softening for the first time. "I'm not going to hurt you, Elian," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. It was the first time he had used his name. The sound of it, in this alpha's deep voice, was a shock. It made him feel seen. It made him feel real. "Breathe," Kyle said, his voice calm and even. "Just breathe." Elian stared at him, his body trembling, caught between a lifetime of conditioning and the undeniable, terrifying truth of his own nature, finally, irrevocably, waking up. The scent was a fever in the air. Kyle stood in the corridor outside Elian's room. his hand pressed against the cool metal of the wall, his knuckles white. He could feel the Omega's distress through the closed door, a palpable wave of shame and fear that clung to the edges of his blooming heat scent. It was a maddening paradox, a scent that was simultaneously a desperate plea for help and an intoxicating invitation. It was the most potent Omega scent Kale had ever encountered, made all the more powerful by its long suppression. It was pure, raw, and utterly overwhelming. His own alpha instincts were a roaring furnace in his chest, a primal urge to break down the door, to go to the Omega, to soothe his distress, to claim the source of that incredible scent. It was a biological imperative, a command written in his DNA, and he was fighting it with everything he had. He was an alpha. He was a leader. His control was absolute. It was the foundation upon which he had built his entire life, the weapon he had wielded to carve a kingdom out of the city's trash heaps. He had faced down armed enforcers, rival syndicates, and the slow, grinding pressure of the Spire's dominance without flinching. But this was an internal war. The scent was a key, turning locks inside him he didn't even know existed. It bypassed his logic, his strategy, his discipline. It spoke directly to his blood. Rhys found him there, his face a mask of concern. "Alpha," he began, then stopped. He could smell it too, even from down the corridor, the powerful, unmistakable scent of an Omega approaching heat. His eyes widened. "Gods," he breathed. "It's that strong." "Get the medical kit," Kale ordered, his voice tight, strained. "The emergency heat suppressants. Now." Rhys hesitated. "Alpha, are you sure? An Omega of his breeding. Forcing a suppression during preheat could be dangerous. It could damage his system." "It's more dangerous to let it run its course," Kyle grated out, his gaze fixed on the door. "Not for him. For everyone. That scent is a beacon. Valerius's hunters will be on us within hours. Every unbound alpha in 3 sectors will be drawn here like moths to a flame. It'll be a bloodbath." Rhys nodded, the tactical reality sinking in. He understood riots. He understood gang wars. He understood the chaos a single, unclaimed Omega in heat could unleash in the pressure cooker of the lower sectors. "I'll get the kit," he said, and hurried away. Kyle closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly, evenly. He could not afford to lose control. He was the only thing standing between Elian and a world that would tear him apart. He was the Omega's protector. The thought was a surprise. When had that happened? When had the political asset become a responsibility? When had the Valerius boy become Elian? He remembered his own youth, a memory he kept locked away. He remembered the Tiberian training camps for young alphas, the endless drills, the psychological conditioning, the breaking of will to remold it in the house's image. He remembered the day he had refused an order to discipline a younger alpha who had shown a moment of hesitation. He remembered the cold, dismissive look on the instructor's face. A flaw in the asset, he had been called. He had been cast out, deemed unworthy, not because he was weak, but because he was not cruel. He would not be that instructor. He would not use this boy's biology against him. Rhys returned with the medkit. Kale took it, his hand steady. "Seal this corridor," he told Rhys. "No one in or out without my direct command, and double the patrols on the perimeter. I want to know the second we get any unwanted visitors." Rhys nodded grimly. "And you, Alpha?" "I'm going in," Kyle said. "He's terrified. He won't let me near him unless I—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He unsealed his collar, a simple leather band that contained a low-level scent dampener. He let it drop to the floor. His own scent, the raw power of it, flooded the corridor, ozone and pine and cold stone pushing back against the sweet, feverish scent of the Omega. It was a declaration, an announcement of dominance, a claim of territory. It was the only language Elian's panicked instincts might understand. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was thick with the scent of heat and fear. Elian was huddled in the corner, his eyes wide and fever-bright, his body trembling violently. The scent of approaching heat was pouring off him in waves, sweet and agonizing. When Kale entered, his own scent rolling in like a thunderhead, Elian flinched back, a small, wounded sound escaping his lips. "No," he whispered. "Please." Kale stopped, holding up the medkit. "This will stop it," he said, his voice low and steady, a calm anchor in the storm of their combined sense. "It's a suppressant. It will give us time." Elian stared at the kit, then back at Kale, his expression a maelstrom of confusion and terror. "Why?" he breathed. "Why would you help me? I'm your enemy. I'm leverage." "You are a person in distress in my territory," Kale said, the words simple, the truth of them absolute. "My reasons don't matter right now. Your safety does." He took a slow step forward. Elian trembled, but he didn't bolt. The sheer, overwhelming power of Kyle's unshielded alpha scent was pinning him in place, terrifying him, but also blanketing him. It was a cage of scent, but it felt different from the spire's chemical prison. It felt protective. "I have to get close enough to administer it," Kale said softly. "I will not hurt you, Elian. I give you my word." He knelt, holding out the injector. Elian stared at him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was caught between a lifetime of being told his instincts were a shameful disease and the presence of an alpha who was offering him not a cure, but a reprieve. An alpha who was offering him a choice. He saw the struggle in Kale's eyes, the rigid control in his posture. He could smell the battle the alpha was fighting with his own nature, and he was choosing to help him. Slowly, hesitantly, his body shaking with a war of instinct and terror, Elian extended his arm. The world dissolved into a hurricane of sensation. The preheat symptoms crashed over Elian in a tidal wave, pulling him under. The room, Kale, the city outside, it all melted away, replaced by a universe of pure, unfiltered biology. He was no longer Ilian Valerius. He was a body, an instinct, a scent. The heat, the true, undeniable heat he had never been allowed to experience, was breaking over him. It was not the shameful clinical event the text described. It was a cataclysm. It was pain, a deep, aching coil of it in his gut, a fire licking at his veins, but it was also pleasure, a shocking, terrifying pleasure that made his skin hypersensitive and his mind go white. He was lost. He was drowning in it. He felt a hand on his arm, large and warm and steady. Kyle. The alpha's scent, a grounding anchor of stone and pine, cut through the chaotic sweetness of his own. He heard Kyle's voice, a low rumble from far away, saying his name. He felt the sharp, cold prick of the needle in his arm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fire in his veins intensified, a last, defiant surge before the chemical dampeners could take hold. He cried out, a sound he didn't recognize, raw and desperate. His body arched, his senses screaming. And in that moment of pure, instinctual agony, something inside him reached out. Not with his hands, not with his voice, but with his scent. It was a silent scream, a beacon of pure, undiluted Omega distress, laced with the fever sweetness of his heat. He called for an alpha, he called for kale, and then another scent answered, not kale's. It was a cold, sterile fragrance that sliced through the thick air of the room like a shard of glass. Sandalwood and expensive spice, a scent of curated power and cold ambition. Marcus, he was here. The thought, a flicker of lucidity in the inferno of his heat, was a lance of pure terror. He wasn't just here. He was close, outside. The realization was a physical shock. He could smell the cold metal of the enforcer's armor, the ozone tang of their charged weapons. They had found him. They had followed his scent, his shameful, beautiful, traitorous scent. The hunters had found their quarry. His terror poured into his scent, changing its composition. The sweet invitation of heat was now laced with the bitter tang of mortal fear. He felt Kyle stiffen, the hand on his arm tightening. The alpha's head snapped towards the window, his entire body going rigid with alarm. "They're here," Kale breathed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The suppressants were beginning to work, banking the fire of the heat, but it was too slow. Elian was still trapped in the haze, his body trembling, his mind only semi-lucid. But he was lucid enough to understand. Marcus hadn't come to rescue him. He had come to retrieve his property. The sound of heavy boots on the metal walkway outside the window confirmed it. Then a voice, amplified and chillingly familiar, cut through the air. "Kale of Corvus, you are harboring stolen property of House Tiberian and House Valerius. Surrender the Omega now, and the Archons may yet show you mercy." Mercy. The word was a joke, a cold smile from a chrome-eyed man. Elian looked at Kale. The Alpha's face was a mask of cold fury. He was trapped, outnumbered, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a grim, deadly resolve. He looked from his men outside to the trembling Omega on the floor. He had made a choice the moment he brought the boy here, and he would see it through. "Reese," Kyle spoke into his wristcom, his voice dangerously calm. "Hostile contact, Tiberian enforcers. Evacuate the civilians. Defend the sector." A burst of static, then Reese's tense reply. "Alpha, there are too many. They have heavy armor." "Hold them as long as you can," Kale commanded. He looked at Elian, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of heat haze and terror. "I will not let them take you," he said. It was not a promise. It was a vow. And in that moment, something shifted in Elian. The shame, the fear, the lifetime of conditioning, it all burned away in the face of this new, more immediate terror. He was not a prize to be won. He was not property to be retrieved. He had not run from one cage just to be dragged back to it. The dregs of the heat were still thrumming through him, a wild, powerful energy. He was weak, disoriented, but he was not helpless. He was an Omega, and his scent, the very thing he had been taught to despise, was a part of him, a weapon. He closed his eyes, shutting out the room, the fear, the encroaching sounds of a battle beginning outside. He focused on the energy inside him, the core of his Omega nature. He reached for his scent, not as a lure, but as something else, something more. He gathered the confusion, the terror, the defiance, the pain, and the pleasure of his aborted heat, gathered it all into a single complex chord of pure, unfiltered emotion. And then, with a will he never knew he possessed, he pushed it out. The scene fractures, a cinematic split screen of controlled violence and internal chaos. Outside, the narrow corridors of Sector Gamma 7 erupt. Tiberian enforcers, clad in pearl-white armor that seems to glow in the sodium light, advance in perfect, disciplined formation. Their movements are economical, their commands issued in clipped, toneless bursts over their internal comms. They are the sterile embodiment of the spire's power, a wave of clean, efficient death. Facing them are the Corvus Syndicate fighters, a motley crew in scavenged gear. Their movements are less disciplined but filled with a desperate, ferocious energy. They use the labyrinthine environment to their advantage, appearing from shadowy alcoves, dropping from overhead gantries. The air crackles with the snap hiss of plasma fire and the percussive thud of kinetic rounds impacting on plasteel and armor. It is a clash of ideologies fought with blood and electricity, the rigid geometry of control against the unpredictable currents of chaos. Reese directs the defense with grim efficiency, his face illuminated by the flashes of weapon fire. He knows this is a holding action. They are outmanned, outgunned. They are buying time. But for what? He isn't sure. He only knows the Alpha gave an order. Inside the room, the air becomes thick, supersaturated with a force that is not physical. Elian, on his knees, becomes the eye of a psychic storm. His scent, weaponized by sheer force of will, pours out of the room, not as a fragrance, but as a wave of pure, unadulterated, emotional data. It washes over the Tiberian enforcers. These are men and women conditioned in sterile environments, their own senses dulled by inhibitors, their emotional responses regulated. They are unprepared for the raw, unfiltered blast of an Omega's heat scent, sharpened to a razor's edge by terror and defiance. The scent bypasses their training. It speaks to the dormant, primal parts of their brains they thought had been bred out of existence. An enforcer at the front of the line stumbles, his helmet display flickering with biofeedback warnings. He smells not just an Omega, but soul-crushing terror, a dizzying spike of pleasure, the ghost of a childhood memory of rain, the cold fury of defiance. It is a sensory overload. His disciplined mind shorts out. He lowers his weapon, confused. Another falters, pressing his helmet to his head as if to block out a phantom noise. The perfect white line of their formation wavers, disrupted not by force of arms, but by an emotional contagion. Marcus Tiberian, observing from a secure position in the rear, sees the disruption on his command feed. "What is this?" he snarls to his comm officer. "Report." The officer, his face pale, stammers, "Sir, the enforcers are reporting emotional compromise, sensory interference. It's the Omega. His scent signature is off the charts. It's unstable." Marcus's perfect face twists into a mask of fury and disbelief. He had expected a frightened, pliant creature, easily subdued. Not this, not a biological weapon. Inside, Kyle feels the shift. He feels the wave of Elian's scent wash over him. But for him, it is different. He is not a sterile product of the spire. He is an alpha who lives in a world of scent and instinct. The raw emotion in Elian's scent does not break him. It connects with him. He feels the boy's terror, his defiance, his desperate plea for freedom. It pours into him, not as a weakness, but as a current of pure energy. A nascent bond, forged in the crucible of this desperate moment, snaps into place between them. It is not a claim. It is an alliance, a shared circuit of will. He feels Elian's fight as his own. The door to the room bursts inward, torn from its hinges by a kinetic ram. Two enforcers, their discipline holding against the sensory assault, storm in, weapons raised. Kyle moves. He is not the calm, observant alpha from the days before. He is a whirlwind of brutal, efficient violence. He crashes into the first enforcer, his arm a piston of force that shatters the man's visor and sends him sprawling. He ducks under the barrel of the second's rifle, his hand shooting out to grip the weapon, twisting it with a sickening crunch of metal and bone. He moves with a speed and ferocity that is more than just training. It is instinct, fueled by the raw energy pouring from the Omega behind him. He is not just defending his territory. He is defending his Omega. The realization strikes him with the force of a physical blow, a truth so profound it clarifies everything. He disarms the second enforcer and throws him back into the corridor. For a moment, there is a lull. He stands in the ruined doorway, a dark, menacing silhouette against the flashing lights of the battle outside. He turns his head, his dark eyes finding Elian's. The boy is pale, sweat-sheened, his body trembling with the effort of what he is doing. But his eyes, for the first time, are clear. The haze of heat and fear is gone, replaced by a fierce, burning light. He is no longer a victim. He is a combatant. Kale gives a short, sharp nod. Acknowledgement, respect, a silent communication that passes between them, deeper than words. The fight is not over, but the dynamic has irrevocably changed. This is no longer a retrieval mission. It is the birth of a rebellion, fought in the corridors of a slum and the heart of a terrified Omega who had finally found his power. The lull was a held breath before a final, desperate plunge. Kale knew the enforcers would recalibrate. Marcus Tiberian was not a man to be deterred by a momentary anomaly. He would simply adapt his tactics, perhaps switching his soldiers' helmet filters to a full sensory blackout, turning them into unfeeling automatons. They had seconds, not minutes. He turned back into the room. The sounds of renewed, more brutal fighting echoing from the corridor. Reese and his people were being pushed back. He crossed to Elian in 2 long strides and knelt before him. The Omega was exhausted, the psychic effort having drained him, leaving him pale and trembling. The powerful wave of his scent had subsided to a low, unsteady pulse. "Can you stand?" Kale asked, his voice low and urgent. Elian looked up at him, his eyes luminous in the dim, chaotic light. He saw no pity in the Alpha's gaze, only a stark, pragmatic concern. He nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Kyle wasted no time. He gripped Elian's arm, pulling him to his feet. The Omega stumbled, his legs weak, and Kyle's arm went around his waist, supporting him. The contact was electric. Through the thin fabric of their tunics, Elian could feel the solid heat of the Alpha's body, the hard muscle, the steady, powerful beat of his heart. It was an anchor in the spinning chaos. For Kale, the sensation of Elian's slender frame pressed against his side was a shock. He was so light, so fragile in build, yet Kale could feel the core of unyielding strength within him, the defiant will that had just thrown an entire squadron of elite soldiers into disarray. He was not fragile. He was a weapon that didn't know its own calibration. "There's a maintenance shaft behind this wall," Kale said, his breath warm against Elian's ear. "It leads to the old aqueduct system. They won't follow us there. The schematics are classified, even for the spire." He guided Elian to the rear wall, his body a shield between the Omega and the ruined doorway. He pressed a sequence of almost invisible seams on the plasteel panel. With a low groan of protesting metal, a section of the wall slid away, revealing a dark, narrow opening that smelled of damp and decay. It was the maw of the unknown. Elian hesitated, his gaze fixed on the abyss. He had run into the darkness once to escape the spire. Now he had to do it again. But this time, he was not alone. Kale looked at him, his dark eyes intense. "I will not leave you," he said, and the simple declaration resonated with the truth of the bond that now hummed between them, a quiet, unbreakable wire. Elian took a breath and nodded. Kale helped him into the shaft, then followed, pulling the panel shut behind them. They were plunged into absolute darkness and a sudden, shocking silence. The sounds of the battle were gone, replaced by the dripping of water and the faint, distant rumble of the city's foundations. Kyle ignited a small chemlight, casting their immediate surroundings in a sickly green glow. They were in a narrow, cylindrical tunnel, slick with algae and grime. A rusty ladder descended into the depths. "This way," Kale said, and started down, never letting go of his grip on Elian's arm. The descent was slow, treacherous. Elian's ceremonial silks, already ruined, were shredded by rust and sharp edges. His body ached, a deep cellular exhaustion setting in as the last of the adrenaline and the heat fever drained away. He moved on pure will, his focus narrowed to the rung in front of him and the steady, guiding presence of the Alpha below. After what felt like an eternity, their feet touched a solid floor. They were in a vast, cavernous space. The green light of the chemlight was swallowed by the immense darkness, but they could hear the slow, steady rush of water nearby. "The old central aqueduct," Kale explained, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Decommissioned a century ago. It runs under the entire city." They were safe, for now. The exhaustion hit Elian all at once, a physical weight that made his knees buckle. Kyle caught him, easing him down to sit on the cold, damp stone floor, his back against the curved wall of the tunnel. Kyle sat beside him, the proximity a silent statement of shared existence. They were a strange pair in the green-tinged darkness, the barbarian Alpha in his functional black gear and the fallen prince in his tattered white silks, both bruised, both bleeding, both fugitives. Kale took a small medpack from his belt. He activated another, brighter chemlight, placing it on the ground between them. In the stark white light, he could see the damage. A long, shallow cut ran along Elian's cheekbone, welling with blood. His hands were scraped raw. Without a word, Kale took out an antiseptic wipe and gently, carefully, began to clean the cut on Elian's face. His touch was unexpectedly tender, his large, calloused fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. Elian flinched at the initial sting, but he didn't pull away. He watched the Alpha's face, his expression taut with concentration. He saw the scar that split his eyebrow, the hard line of his jaw, the deep, steady focus in his eyes. This was the man his father called a monster. This monster was tending his wounds in the guts of the city after saving him from the pristine, perfect world that wanted to put him back in his cage. The irony was a bitter, aching thing. When Kyle finished, his gaze met Elian's. The bond between them was a quiet, living presence in the silence. It wasn't the fiery, possessive thing the text described. It was a deep, resonant hum of mutual recognition, of shared survival, of a choice freely made in the heart of a battle. "Thank you," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. Kyle simply nodded, his eyes holding Elian's. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing away a stray drop of blood from beneath Elian's eye. The gesture was intimate, profound. It was a promise of protection, an acknowledgement of his humanity. In the cold, dark, forgotten depths of the city, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the uncertainty of the future, Elian Valerius finally felt safe. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, and he was not alone. The sun, or what passed for it in Ethelberg's perpetual twilight, was a smear of bruised purple and tarnished gold on the horizon. Elian watched it from the shattered window of a derelict transit hub high in the city's forgotten upper levels. The spire, the gleaming needle of his former life, stood serene and untouchable in the distance, its crystalline walls catching the morning light. It looked like a jewel, a beautiful, hollow jewel. It no longer felt like home. It felt like a monument to a life that belonged to someone else, a ghost he had shed in the dark, wet tunnels below. He was stiff. His body ached with a profound, bone-deep weariness, and the tattered remains of his ceremonial silks were a pathetic mockery of his former status. But he felt clean. The suppressants were gone. The chemical fog had lifted from his mind. For the first time, he could feel the city not just as a visual construct, but as a living entity. He could feel its vibrations through the soles of his bare feet, smell its complex, layered scents on the cool morning air. Kale stood a few feet away, a silent, watchful presence. He had led them on a winding, circuitous path through the city's forgotten ways, moving with an instinctual knowledge of the urban wilderness. They had emerged here, in this skeletal ruin of glass and steel, a place that had once been a nexus of transit and commerce, now left to rot when the city's growth had shifted. It was a ghost of progress, a perfect hiding place. After their escape, after the quiet intimacy of the aqueduct, a new silence had fallen between them. It was not the tense, uncertain silence of their first days together. This silence was comfortable, laden with the weight of all that had happened. It was the silence of two people who had seen the truth of each other in a moment of crisis and had no need for the artifice of words. Elian turned from the window and looked at Kyle. The alpha was staring at the spire, his expression unreadable. In the soft morning light, the hard edges of his face seemed to soften. He looked less like a warlord and more like a man burdened by the weight of his choices. He was responsible for hundreds of people in the lower sectors. By sheltering Elian, by openly defying House Tiberian, he had put all of them at risk. The guilt of that, sharp and unfamiliar, pricked at Elian. "Your people," he said, his voice quiet. "Because of me, they're in danger." Kale didn't look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the distant spire. "My people are always in danger," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That is the nature of freedom in this city. It must be defended every day. Yesterday was no different." He finally turned to face Elian. "You didn't start this war. You were just a symptom of it. A system that prizes control above all else will eventually devour its own. You just chose not to be eaten." He was right. Elian's flight from the ceremony wasn't the cause of the conflict. It was merely the spark that had lit a fuse that had been laid long ago. He was the illogical variable that the system's cold equations could not account for. He looked down at his own hands, still scraped and dirty. He was no longer Elian of House Valerius. That boy, the perfect, polished asset, had died in the sterile air of the assembly hall. He didn't know who this new person was, this person who could weaponize his own scent, who could stand beside a barbarian alpha and feel not fear, but a strange sense of belonging. The future was a terrifying, formless void. but it was his. Kyle took a step closer. He held out a bundle of dark, practical clothing. A simple tunic, sturdy pants, soft boots, the uniform of the lower sectors. "You can't stay in those," he said, gesturing to the ruined silks. The unspoken meaning was clear. You can't be who you were. Elian took the clothes. The fabric was coarse but strong. He retreated to a shadowed corner of the hub to change, his back to Kyle. As he stripped off the last vestiges of his old life, he felt a profound sense of release. The silks were a costume, a cage of fabric. The new clothes were anonymous, functional. They were the clothes of a survivor. When he emerged, Kyle looked at him, a long, appraising gaze. In the dark clothes, his pale hair and skin stood out in stark relief. He no longer looked like a fallen prince. He looked like a ghost, a myth from the spire that had taken on solid form in the shadows of the Undercity. The bond between them hummed, a low, constant frequency beneath the surface of their awareness. It was a strange, new limb, an extension of his senses that connected him to the Alpha. He could feel Kale's steady calm, the deep well of his strength, and beneath it, a current of fierce, unwavering protectiveness directed entirely at him. It was a feeling more powerful and real than any sterile promise Marcus Tiberian could have made. "What now?" Elian asked, the question hanging in the dusty air. Kyle's gaze shifted back to the city skyline. "Now, we disappear. My territory is no longer safe for you. For us, Tiberian and your father will tear the lower sectors apart looking for you. We'll use the old ways, the forgotten paths. We'll go where they can't follow." He was talking about the wilds, the toxic, untamed lands beyond Ethelberg's environmental shields, places that existed only as warnings on maps. It was a death sentence for someone raised in the spire's purified air. But the thought of it didn't frighten Elian. The city was the prison. The wilds were an unknown, but they were an unknown he would face with this Alpha. It was a choice. Kale walked to the edge of the shattered window, looking down. "We move at nightfall," he said. Elian came to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. They stood in silence, watching the city they were both leaving behind. One had been cast out from it. The other had escaped it. Together, they were turning their backs on it. Elian felt a sudden, impulsive urge. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before brushing against the back of Kyle's hand. The contact was brief, a ghost of a touch, but Kyle didn't pull away. He simply stood there, a solid, warm presence beside him. It was not a grand declaration. It was a quiet beginning, a silent promise made in a ruined transit hub at the edge of the world, between a renegade Alpha and the Omega who had chosen chaos, and in doing so had found himself